Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at why polls are mostly wrong in the recent presidential elections. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson and of course to answer the comprehension questions as they coincide with the reading. Please remember that you can replay this presentation for detail or clarity later. Let's go and get started. Why polls were mostly wrong. In the weeks leading up to the November 2016 election, polls across the country predicted an easy sweep for Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton, from Vanuatu to Timbuktu. Everyone knows what happened. Media outlets and pollsters took the heat for failing to project a victory for Donald Trump. The polls were ultimately right about the popular vote, but they missed the mark in key swing states that tilted the Electoral College toward Trump. This time, prognosticators made assurances that such mistakes were so 2016. But as votes were tabulated on November 3rd, nervous viewers and pollsters began to experience a sense of déjà vu. Once again, more ballots were ticking toward President Trump than the polls had projected. So though the voter surveys ultimately pointed in the wrong direction, only two swing states, North Carolina and Florida, both of which had signaled a win for Joe Biden, they incorrectly gauged just how much the overall vote would go to Trump in both red and blue states. In states where polls had favored Biden, the vote margin went to Trump by a median of 2.6 additional percentage points. And in Republican states, Trump did even better than the polls had indicated, by a whopping 6.4 points. 4 years ago, Sam Wang, a neuroscience professor at Princeton University and co-founder from the blog Princeton Election Consultorium, which analyzes election polling, called the race for Clinton. He was so confident that he made a bet to eat an insect if Trump won more than 240 electoral votes, and ended up downing a cricket live on CNN. Wang is coy about any plans for arthropod consumption in 2020, but his predictions were again optimistic. He pegged Biden at 342 electoral votes and projected that Democrats would have 53 Senate seats and a 4.6 percentage gain in the House of Representatives. Broadly, there was a polling error of about 2.5 percentage points across the board in close states and blue states for the presidential race. This was similar in size to the polling error in 2016, but it mattered less this time because the race wasn't as close. The main thing that has changed since 2016 is not the polling but the political situation. I would say that worrying about polling is, in some sense, worrying about the 2016 problem. And the 2020 problem is ensuring there is a full and fair count and ensuring a smooth transition. The big polling errors in red states are the easiest to explain because there's a precedent. In states that are historically not very close for the presidency, the winning candidate usually overperforms, but it's long been known turnout is lower in states that aren't competitive for the presidency because our weird electoral college mechanism. That effect, the winner's bonus, might be enhanced in very red states by the pandemic. If you're in a very red state and you're a Democratic voter, you know your vote doesn't actually affect the outcome of the presidential race. You might be slightly less motivated to turn out during a pandemic. That's one kind of polling error that I don't think we need to be concerned about, but the error we probably should be concerned about is the 2.5 percentage point error in close states. That error happened in swing states, but also in Democratic trending states. For people who watch politics closely, the expectation was that we had a couple of roads we could have gone down on election night. Some states count and report votes on election night, and other states take days to report. But the polls beforehand pointed toward the possibility of North Carolina and Florida coming out for Biden. That would have effectively ended the presidential race right there. But the races were close enough that there was also the possibility that things would continue. And in the end, that's what happened. We were watching more counting happen in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Nevada. The Senate errors were a bigger deal. There were even 7 Senate races where the polling showed races within the points in either direction. Roughly speaking, that meant a range of outcomes for between 49 and 56 Democratic seats. A small polling miss had a pretty consequential outcome because every percentage point missed would lead to, on average, another Senate seat going one way or the other. Missing a few points in the presidential race was not a big deal this year, but missing by a few points in Senate races mattered. The real reason polling matters is to help people determine where to put their energy. If we had a more accurate view of where the races were going to end up, it would have suggested political activists put more energy into the Georgia and North Carolina Senate races. And it's a weird error that the Senate polls were off by more than the presidential polls. One possible explanation would be that voters were paying less attention to the Senate races than the presidential races and therefore were unaware of their own preference. Very few Americans lack awareness of whether they prefer Trump or Biden. But maybe more people would be unaware of their own mental processes for, say, whether it's Republican incumbent Tom Tillis versus Democratic challenger Cal Cunningham in North Carolina Senate race, because American politics have been extremely polarized for the past 25 years. People tend to and end up voting a straight ticket for their party, their own party too. David Shore, a data analyst who was formerly head of the political data science at the company of civics analysts, recently pointed out the possibility that people who respond to polls are not a representative sample. They're pretty weird in the sense that they're willing to pick up a phone and stay on the phone with the pollster. He gave evidence that people were more likely to pick up the phone if they're Democrats, more likely to pick up under the conditions of a pandemic, and more likely to pick up the phone if they score high in the domain of social trust. It's fascinating. The idea is that a poll respondents score higher on social trust than the general population. Because of that, they're not a representative sample of the population. That could be skewing the results. This is also related to the idea that states with more of like QAnon followers experience more inaccurate polling. The QAnon belief system is certainly correlated with lower social trust, and those who might be people who are simply not going to pick up the phone. If you believe in a monstrous conspiracy of sex abuse involving one of the major political parties of the US, then you might be paranoid. One could not rule out the possibility that paranoid people would also be disinclined to answer opinion polls. Pollsters know Hispanic voters to be a difficult to reach demographic. In addition, Hispanics also are not a monolith population. If you look at some of the exit polling, it looks like Hispanics were more favorable to Trump than they were to Clinton 4 years ago. It's certainly possible Hispanic support was missed by pollsters in the time around. But I think polling is critically important because it's a way by which we can measure public sentiment more vigorously than any other method. Polling plays a critical role in our society, and one thing we shouldn't do is convert polling data into probabilities. That obscures the fact that polls can be a few points off, and it's better to leave the reported data in units of opinion as a percentage favoring a candidate, rather than to try to convert it to a whole probability. It's best not to force too much meaning out of a poll. If a race looks like it's within 3 or 4 points in either direction, we should simply say it's a close race, and not force the data to say something that they can't. I think pollsters will take this inaccuracy and try to do better, but at some level, we should stop expecting too much out of the polling data. So as you guys can see, that right there is just a great overview of the recent presidential election, the role that polling played, and also, in a sense, the results that came from the realities that might have stemmed away from polling. Only time will tell whether or not pollsters and polls alike will adjust and adapt their models. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the lesson.